All right, welcome to Words of the Wise. Today we have Chief Chad Martin from Wilder PD in Kentucky. It is so clear that Chief Martin has a deep passion for law enforcement wellness, and I am just so excited to have him on the show. So, Chief Martin, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for being here. I messed that one up.
That's okay. Welcome. So I want to kind of jump right in. I know we had some conversations offline, and I'm really excited to talk to you about wellness. It really is clear that you have a passion for wellness. I want to know, one of the conversations that is always brought up is your why and why you got into law enforcement. And then, of course, we want to talk about your wellness why as well. But from a law enforcement perspective, why did you get into this profession? What was that driving force for you to enter into law enforcement?
It's interesting because I had zero interest in law enforcement growing up. I was not around anybody in law enforcement. So I never felt that it would be a career path for me. My father was a Navy veteran on submarines. He was you would think Toby Keith talks about his dad like the American patriot. That was my dad. So you always had a flag flying, and I followed in those footsteps. Of 2 weeks after high school graduation, I was in Chicago for Navy boot camp and started a career in naval intelligence. So I thought that would be my career path. But it wasn't until I was on a ship deployed to the Persian Gulf, and they were asking for some guys to volunteer to get on these little small boats, and we would go over and board these big cargo ships and inspect them for sanction violations. And they said, we got to get you guys some training before you do these inspections. And they sent us to 2 weeks over Coronado. I worked with a couple of the SEAL instructors on how to do room clearing and firearms. And that was my first exposure to anything of like a law enforcement. And as a 19-year-old, I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do the rest of my life.
And what was it about that you felt like this was it? Was it helping others? Like, was there one thing that you can remember as like a defining moment where you were like, this is why this is it?
I do now, but at the time I didn't.
Sure. When you're young, it's so hard to have that perspective.
Yeah, it took many years to figure that out, and that's part of the wellness journey. But working in a room with headphones in front of a computer all day doing
Right.
intelligence work, the mission was very important, but I didn't feel like I was doing anything. So to actually be out there hands on, and the adrenaline that comes from doing those type of operations, that would later kind of be the epiphany of, you were an adrenaline junkie. You were seeking and that high speed stuff. And that's what pulled me to it, I think.
And I hear this so often with the younger generation. I do think that, when you're young, you do seek that. You're like, this is exciting, and I feel like I'm doing good, and I have a purpose. And I think that is, something that I've heard a few times with, the younger. And then of course, when you evolve and you get older, I think things start to change, and your purpose and your mission changes a little bit as you get older. So I'd love to talk about, how that progressed for you over the years. So just so we all know, how long have you been on the job? How long have you been in law enforcement?
I started in 1998, working for the city of Lexington, Kentucky. And then from there, I did a very high crime, low income area that was full of drugs, prostitution, shootings, stabbings. We were a very busy, paced environment. And after about 3 years of working there on night shift, I could start to see that, hey, I need a break from this. It was starting to affect me. And I actually moved to an agency that was the polar opposite, where it was very rural. It was just country policing. Wintertime, you may go 2 weeks without a dispatch call if you weren't self-initiating something. So it was what I needed, major slowdown, change of pace, but in turn turned out to be really not a good fit for me because I started missing that adrenaline need.
Sure. And can you tell me, because I know that, I mean, we all know that wellness wasn't really a thing back then. Like we've only started to see this push in momentum in wellness maybe in the last 5, 10 years. And so back then, when you were working in this high crime environment, and you said that it started to affect you mentally, what resources do you wish you had back then that you didn't, or that you could have utilized back then that just weren't available?
Everything for me now would be, in hindsight, there was no education about it. I didn't know what we needed. I didn't know what we were missing. But the critical debriefs, and you go to a pretty violent murder scene, and you just cleared the call and went to the next one. There was no conversation about it. There was, nobody had a discussion. Check in on you the next day, the day after. Are you good? So at the time, it was the atmosphere. You toughened up. You got back to work, and there was times where we would have calls holding. So you go to something, it's, a pretty violent scene. And once the detectives and the crime scene guys got there, you just cleared and went to the next call and back to business. So you don't think about it then, but now knowing what I know, it's just like agencies are starting to see the picture of how, by not having programs in place and not working with these officers, a lot of the symptoms we see that you associate with bad police officers are symptoms of the undealt trauma they're dealing with. And I think now we're finally starting to say, hey, we need to start putting some things in place. There's a nationwide police shortage. The last thing we want to do is start losing these people that are still willing to do this job.
100%. I love how you put that, of the actions are a result of the undealt trauma. And I 100% agree with you. I think that it's not a black and white picture. You have to take a look at past experiences to understand behavior. And the more you can be proactive and get in front of it and be able to process those things, the better off everyone's going to be in the way that they respond to situations. So I love how you put that. I think that is spot on.
Thanks.
Can you tell me, was there, because I know that you're really passionate about wellness, and obviously you said that this progressed over your career, but was there like a defining moment for you that happened on the job that made you prioritize it, where you were like, we need to do this? Was there like one moment, or do you think it was a collection of different events that kind of brought you to this place of, hey, we need to really step up and focus on wellness?
Mine was a lifelong of learning of before I figured out what had taken place. I was brought up in a traumatic home, no fault of my parents. I had two great parents, but my father had a previous marriage. And when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, um, my stepbrother came to live with us, and we found out that he had been through horrific living conditions, a lot of narcotics use, domestic violence, probably some prostitution exposure. Just, he was a troubled youth when he came. And we all know that hurt people hurt people. Mm-hmm. He was about 6 years older than me, and he basically terrorized our home many years. And I had routine calls of police coming to our house to deal with him, just being his victim of lots of abuse. So never understanding that experience as a child, I found out through recent years of attending a lot of peer support training and wellness training that you wouldn't believe the amount of military, dispatch, firemen, law enforcement that all come from traumatic childhoods. And there's just something wired in you that calls you to this line of work, to like, hey, I want to try to stop this from happening to somebody else. Or that undealt trauma does create a lot of adrenaline seeking, because that adrenaline allows you to check out for a moment of your own mind And that kind of is the summary of my life. I got into martial arts, got into fighting in tournaments, I got into motorcycle road racing, everything that would allow me to just do something high speed and check out. That was my lifestyle. And that lifestyle, when I got into the Navy, got into law enforcement, I ended up taking any time that I wasn't involved in that high speed adrenaline. So what do? We self medicate. So now we started drinking and we try to check out mentally. And those just all snowballed, ended up causing me a huge issue in my life. Ended up losing a job over just performance and discipline issues. And I thought I was done with law enforcement after about 6 years in, and said, I'll never be back. And went and started some small businesses, rode the roller coaster of businesses. They would collapse. I would find myself in very dark, depressed states. Was married, had 3 small children when 2008 hit and collapsed the small business we were running at the time. So now you've got this guy that feels like he's failed in law enforcement, failed in his military career, failed a small business. And I really felt like there is just this time where I have no value. I have no purpose here. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, my wife was brought up in a strong Christian home. And if it wasn't for the hope that she had, I don't know like where I would have found my hope to keep pushing. And being able to get in, start reading those words in red and refocus life and say, there's a purpose out here. I don't know what it is, but I've got to find it. And that kind of started my resilience back to, we got to figure out who you are, what you're supposed to do. And eventually many years later, ended up back in the business and made it back to police chief.
I've like have chills. First of all, thank you for sharing that story. I can relate to so many things that you said personally on a deep level. I too come from a background of childhood trauma, and everything that you said, I'm shaking my head like, yes, that's exactly the life I had, and I think that a lot of people can relate to that, because you're 100% right. There are so many people in this profession who come from broken homes and who want to feel like they can have that deeper meaning and deeper purpose in their life and be able to help others. And so often we don't realize, even when you said seeking adrenaline, I don't think that a lot of people realize that that is a result. Because I did the same thing. I was a professional skydiver for several years. So you're talking about adrenaline. I'm like, yeah, that's 100%, because you feel free of whatever, was, tying you down, or free from having to think about it for a few minutes, and so I can deeply relate to that. I know a lot of people who are listening to this could deeply relate to that as well. And then, of course, the conversation of escaping and numbing and, going down those paths, I had a very similar thing happen too, where I woke up on the floor and was like, if I don't make a change, I'm going to end up just like my parents, and you have these like moments where you wake up and you're like, it's, you have this crossroad of, I can go down this bad path, or I can make a positive change for myself. And it sounds like you went down the path of, let's make a positive change, and, let's get back on our feet. And, I think that it's also a testament to how important support systems are. And it sounds to me like you had a really supportive home life and a really supportive spouse that helped you to get there. And I think that a lot of people who are listening, a lot of times you feel so alone in those times. And so knowing that you're not alone, and that, maybe you don't have a spouse, but you have a whole community who can relate and who can help get you off the ground and back onto your feet. So what a story of resiliency to make it back to police chief, and now being able to prioritize wellness for your people. I really, really appreciate you sharing that.
Well, I've at least got to share the miracle of how I got here, because I think the miracle itself was there was a new mayor in our city, and the new mayor um, took office, and the police chief at the time, he was ready to retire. He went into retirement. The mayor decided to do an in-house process. And at the time, I was the third shift patrolman. I didn't know anybody because I never saw anybody. I would come into work after everybody had gone home for the day, and I would go home before they came in for the day. So after about 5 years in this agency, nobody knew I existed except, the two guys that I worked with on our night shift. And once we did the meeting with the mayor, he decided he was going to do the internal appointment. There was about, three or four of us put in for it. My competition, and I was going in for a learning experience. I just knew that, like, hey, this would be a good learning experience for me. I'm going to put in for this chief's application. I was going against the lieutenant, the second in command. I was going against our police detective, who just happened to be the son of our city administrator, who had been with the city for over 30 years. I was going against the most senior patrolman, who had been with the agency almost 15 years. And then there was me. And we were going to go in front of a panel of chiefs from neighboring agencies. When I found out who was going to be on the interview board, it was the chief from the neighboring county where I had gotten in trouble and left law enforcement. So I did not leave on good terms with a black eye to the agency. The chief of the next city over, where I was working when I quit to come to this city for better pay and benefits, who I'm sure didn't enjoy that transfer, because you're always, having to replace a guy, and a council member who had been with the city for like over 30 years. So I knew going into that, I didn't have a chance.
Right.
And I had stressed out so much. My wife came to me and she said, I'm going to tell you something. And she goes, I'm afraid to tell you. She said, I know I heard God's voice say, you're going to get this position. And she goes, but if you don't, because I don't think there's any way that you're going to be able to, I don't know how I'm going to be able to respond. And I ended up getting the position.
Wow.
And it defeated all odds. Nobody could explain how it happened.
I mean, I think, again, like, I don't know, I have like chills. I think it's a testament to your journey. Like, I think that you needed to be there, and that you had worked so hard to get there, that, and I think too, so, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but, my trajectory, I never felt like I was good enough, ever. Like, I always, like, and you said this a few times, but like, I never thought that I was worthy. I was never enough. And so I think that sometimes we kind of lead with that of like, there's no way that this is going to happen for me because I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. And I think that that's, again, it goes back to that trauma response of like, there's no way. But obviously you were qualified and worthy, and now here you are doing an amazing job. And so I think that this is exactly where you were meant to be.
The life journey will humble you and change you. And that was the hardest part, is so many of the people, they knew me from the guy that was the not very good team member, not somebody that we would want to work with or work for. And I hadn't seen a lot of these people in that 10 or 15 years I was out of law enforcement in the small business world. And that becoming a new person and coming back wasn't the same person.
Yeah.
And, there's ways to change you through the hardships of life, and you come out on the other side with a different view. And I was starting to see that, the arrogant person that I was, which was just a response, a defense mechanism.
Right.
I was starting to educate myself on why am I doing this? Why do I act this way? And like, I've got to fix this.
And how do you feel that that has impacted the way that you now lead?
It's servant-based leadership where before I would have done what you see so many agencies do that's so toxic. You know, I'm the boss. We're going to do what I say because I'm the boss. And I decided to come back in and say, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, guys. We're going to sit down here at the table and here's what my thought is. What do you all think? And all the way down to the most junior, newest patrolman, you get a voice.
Mm.
And I'm still going to decide what we're going to do. It may or may not be what you think's best, but everybody gets a voice. Everybody gets an opinion. And it's just a different type of leadership where I'll try to be officer focused. So you guys know that you matter, you have a value. And in this time where, like I said, there's not a lot of people lining up to do this job,
Right.
guys will bring some loyalty to the agency when they say, hey, I'm valued here. I have a voice.
Yeah. And I think too, like it goes back to knowing that there are so many people in this profession who maybe had a childhood or an upbringing where they didn't feel valued and they didn't feel like they're enough. And now they have leadership looking them in the eye and saying, no, you do matter. And you're so important to this operation and we care about you. And I think, excuse me, that speaks volumes. And I'm curious, how have you seen the shift in morale and wellness within your agency by taking that approach of, hey, you have a voice and you're important? How have you seen your officers respond to that?
Well, I started to see that I was going to be in a tough spot because the agency right next to me is one of the top paying agencies in the state.
Mm.
So it was always a trend that we would lose our best officers to them. It was just a natural stepping stone. So in this time where you're running out of replacements, I knew I had to get creative. And by getting creative, I said, we're going to do something completely different outside the box nobody's doing. And people are starting to do it now. So I wish I could have patented or trademarked my program, but you would see a lot of shifts where there was people working 4 10-hour days, or there were people working 12-hour shifts, but they would do rotating days. We came up with a schedule where the guys would work 3 12-hour days, and then they would dedicate 4 hours to health and wellness. And they had to account for it. So every week you have to do on your timesheet, what did you spend that 4 hours for?
Oh.
And they're either working out, they're going to therapy sessions, they're going to doctor's appointments. Even if it's something where you're volunteering, going to church and getting involved somehow, you're going to document those hours to get your 40 hours in, but that gives them 3 days on, 4 days off. And that 4 days off allowed them to really recharge. And we started to see officers take a pay cut to come to our agency because that time off and that wellness focus was more important to them than the dollar.
Well, I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with law enforcement agencies, and I've never heard that. So you mandated wellness. You said, hey, like you need to take at least 4 hours a week for you and your physical and mental wellness, and you need to show proof. And wow, I love that. And everyone's doing it. There was no pushback, there was buy-in, and now you're seeing retention because of it. Wow, that's amazing. And are these programs, it could be anything, or do you have kind of give me some insight into what you're offering, for the agency? Do you have any sort of wellness programming in place? Like I know you said working out, peer support, things like that. And kind of a second two-part of that question is, what resource have you found that's been the most impactful and effective. Even just looking at your guys and girls and what they're documenting, what has been the biggest impact for physical and mental wellness that you've seen?
Well, what we did was uh, there in the state of Kentucky, they have a physical fitness test that once you're out of the police academy, you pass that test, you never have to take it again. So I took that same police academy test, brought it back and said, guys, we're going to do this once a year. And if you pass the PT test, we're actually going to do a payment incentive. So we actually pay them to stay fit and pass their test. So that was one incentive. The 4 days off just to get away and disconnect has been huge. That's probably the number one thing that people say they don't want to lose, that 4 days off, because what do we do on our off days? Well, we pick up overtime shifts and off-duty details. So when the guys are getting 2 days off a week, they end up working 1 or 2 days their off day. Next thing you know, they've gone 18, 20 days in a row, hadn't had a day off.
Right.
And between that and the peer support program we launched, we were the first. We started a multi-county peer support team. If you didn't feel comfortable talking with an officer from your own agency, you can now talk to somebody as far as 2 counties away. So we started a multi-county peer support team. We've had that running for about 2 years. And I think between the guys being able to say, I can talk to somebody, we've got the posters hanging up in the patrol room. If there's any concerns about the stigma of mental health, you're not going to find it here. We make it a top priority so the guys are comfortable knowing that they can use the programs that are there. They can reach out. It's not going to affect them career-wise.
I love what you just said about if there's a stigma, you're not going to find it here. Like, how powerful is that statement? If there's a stigma on mental health, you're not going to find it here. Because I do find that it's interesting because there's still like this locker room talk that's like so stigmatized, like we would never do that. Like that is for people who are XYZ, XYZ. And then behind closed doors, people are needing or seeking, privately. And of course, we want to keep things confidential. You don't want to, if people don't want to share, they don't need to or have to. But that stigma that I think has existed for so long, for you to say you're not going to find it here, period, powerful.
And I think that no matter how many programs you have, if the guys are afraid to use them because now I may not get that promotion or it's going to reflect negatively on me, the programs don't mean anything. They've got to feel comfortable enough that they can use them, that there's not going to be any type of repercussion for it.
100%. I love that. So if you were just, because I know that there are a lot of agencies that are still in their infancy stage of building wellness programs and implementing different resources. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to anyone else in leadership just starting out, what would that be? How could someone get started to create that culture that you've created within your agency where wellness is accepted and it's prioritized and it's mandatory to take care of yourself? So, what one piece of advice would you give to someone who's like, I don't know what to do, or I don't know how to start, or I want to create that culture that you have. How do I do it?
It's got to start at the top. You can't take a sergeant or a patrolman, say, hey, you're the wellness coordinator. It's got to start at the top.
100%. So your number one piece of advice would be lead from the front. Take responsibility, take accountability for wellness, listen to your people, but ultimately you're the one at the top that is leading the charge.
If the chief's not bought in, people will always be reluctant.
And I'm like shaking my head. I know if someone's listening to the audio, maybe they don't hear me, but I'm like shaking my head because there's been such a conversation about buy-in. And I'd love to hear your insights on this because this is the first time I've heard someone say this, where it's like chief has to be bought in, and then that trickles down, and then everyone else will buy in as well. What is your opinion on this concept or this idea of buy-in? Because I've heard so many times where everyone's like, well, we're not going to do something unless people buy in, or people aren't going to buy in, so we're not going to do it. So, what would be your opinion or your solution for buy-in?
I wish I had the answer to the solution, but I don't. The peer support team we started, it was actually the concept of I was going to start one. The neighboring agency was going to start one. A couple of agencies down was going to start one. So then we found out through our Chiefs Association that we're all starting these individualized peer support teams. And that's when we said, why don't we just make one big one that is multi-county, and that allows the people to talk to people from other agencies, and why reinvent the wheel, time and time again. And in our area, for the agencies that are one big one that serve the whole county, Northern Kentucky is very unique, where we have multiple agencies crammed into one county. So we actually have this team will go across the 3 northern counties. That when we started that team, and we were getting the Chiefs Association to distribute information, say, tell your guys about the team. We want applications. Who wants to be on it? We're going to do interviews to see who would make a good fit for the peer team member. There was months that would go by, and we would find out that the emails and the information was not getting distributed to the officers. So there was agencies were like, yeah, we're all in. There's other agencies who are like, we're not too sure about this. Some of them have come around, but I still think there's places out there that just don't see a value in it.
Mm. And so that's interesting. So, because I think you're 100% right. There has to be, especially when you're talking about leadership, you have to see the value in what you're doing. But I also think that there's solidarity when you start to bring people together, and then the people who aren't bought in or don't see the value kind of become the outliers a little bit, especially when you come together and everyone is on board and saying like, hey, like this is important, we see value. And then the people who maybe don't become, the ones on the outside a little bit. And I think that's what creates that change, is eventually they're going to be like, wait, everyone else is doing it, why am I not? And then there's that like internal reflection of like, okay, well now we should buy in. So when the people are resistant to it, whether that's leadership or individuals within the organization, if they're on the outskirts because everyone else is prioritizing it, then I think that creates change as well. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think that's law enforcement as a whole, whether it's changing, something in the use of force policy, something in the pursuit policy, something on the equipment. It is slow change. And you've always got your early adopters, quick to innovate. And then you'll see that gradual start accepting. And then your outliers almost, we've got to, because everybody else is doing it at that point. I think that's just the norm in the industry on anything.
Right. And I think that that's how wellness has evolved, over time as well. Like I know you've been in this space for a lot longer than I have, but I started in wellness for law enforcement 8 years ago. And it's been that slow trickle momentum to getting to where we are today, which is far beyond what we were, even 8 years ago. So I completely agree.
One of the health and wellness symposiums I went to recently, it was kind of sad because one of the speakers, there was a clinician that said, look around the room. We're all the chiefs and the command staff. I see a bunch of officers. So until you all promote and get into leadership, we're never going to see this pick up momentum. And that's kind of a sad statement to think about when you look at the statistics of how many officers we lose each year to suicide. I don't think you have time to wait for these young officers to get into leadership position. We kind of need to start making this a priority everywhere.
100%. I 100% agree with you. So I have one final question for you, and this is really, the reason why I started. I know we talked offline about this, but one of the major reasons I started this podcast was because we had conversations like what you just said about, you have this interesting dynamic right now where you have kind of the current and older generation that came from, shut up, show up, rub dirt on it, didn't have the resources. Um, and and now you have this new generation that's coming in, and they are not only more receptive to wellness, I think that they are looking for their agency to support them in their wellness. But the younger generation, there is a little bit of invincibility to that. And, you talked about that being young and adrenaline and, and I was the same way of like, we're not going to get hurt. And, you're not really thinking about mental health stuff when you're, younger, but especially when you're early in the career, I don't think that you're quite thinking that far ahead. And I've had so many conversations with leadership who have told me like, I wish I would have listened to this when I was earlier in my career, or I wish I would have known about this. And maybe it would have saved me an injury. Maybe it would have saved me a marriage. Maybe it would have saved me, losing my job and, having to find my way back. If there was one piece of advice that you could give to the younger generation or the up and coming generation when it comes to wellness, what would that be?
Probably there are more out there than you think that are willing to tell you the truth of how the job has affected them. But it's going to take a trust where you don't do the great thing of, hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you? I'm great.
Right.
You've got to find people that you can sit down and talk with, be vulnerable and transparent. They'll talk to you, but nobody's going to want to share those experiences if they're afraid that it's going to be something used against them. It's going to be rumor mill. So you've got to build trust with your agency or your peer teams.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing all of your words of wisdom. You really, truly are inspiring, and I appreciate you being here. And is there anything else that you want to leave with? Any other words of advice or anything that you want to say as a final word?
My only words of advice are, like I said, in this time right now, they're not kicking down the doors to get into this profession. So if you're in leadership, you've got to invest in your people because if not, somebody else will.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chief Martin. I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Oh.